Now, I know Mel Gibson's career and legacy has been all over the place, and there's a lot of scandal involved, but this movie is just epic. Braveheart. Now, Braveheart came out in 1995, was directed by Mel Gibson, stars Mel Gibson. This was Mel Gibson's big project. This is the movie that really established him as a movie director. Now, this is not the first time he's directed anything, but this is the first time he took on a project head on with his vision, his influence, really propelling this whole movie. This is Mel Gibson's movie. And even though film is clearly a collaborative effort, no person does it entirely by themselves, but this is clearly Mel Gibson's vision on display. And this is the movie that really cemented him as that auteur filmmaker. He'd already been an actor for a long time. He was a huge star when this movie came out, and now we have Braveheart. And Braveheart is really the story of these two historical figures, William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, who were real historical figures in Scotland while it was under the thumb of England. Scotland was not exactly free, and while this movie definitely takes liberties with the source material, with the real history, and it's not the most historically accurate movie. I know there's a lot of people that have debunked some of the myth-making that Mel Gibson incorporated into this movie. But the thing with Mel Gibson movies is that a lot of times he does go for these historical period dramas because I think that's just what he likes to tackle. He likes these epic stories. And while he does often change things like character motivation, character relationships, or even how people dress or act in a certain way, it's all intentional to further a compelling story. And Braveheart, as romanticized or fictionalized as it is a compelling story about freedom, about liberty, about a small revolution that happened in Scotland that ultimately ended poorly for William Wallace, but is so inspiring to watch because you see that same sentiment echoed with Moses in the Exodus story. And even with our own revolution here in America trying to revolt against the king, that spark of liberty will always be a compelling story. And Mel Gibson crafts this story in a way that really help you get behind William Wallace. And I think all of the creative decisions that Mel Gibson made, fictional or not, are there to further that end, to make you get behind William Wallace and to make you feel that thirst for liberty that all the Scots feel in this movie. And Braveheart pulls that off fantastically. I think it is the first scene in the movie where you see William Wallace as a little boy and he goes to see what's going on with this secret meeting that his dad and all the other lords of Scotland were having with the king, and they're just all dead. All the lords of Scotland are dead. They were all hung. I think that really messed him up, and it immediately puts you in the perspective of William Wallace. You know that this king is ruthless, he's a tyrant, and now seeing that a young, impressionable boy is exposed to this horror, you are immediately on their side. Anything that he or any other Scotsman needs to do to get their freedom, you are 100% on board with. And then the movie just takes you for a ride. You see him grow up with his uncle, who's played by Brian Cox, and Brian Cox does a great job here. He's kind of the mentor figure. He only gets a couple scenes, but he does get to drop a few pearls of wisdom before he ages out of this movie, because the next time we see William Wallace, he's a full-grown Mel Gibson. He's riding into town. He speaks like 3 different languages, maybe more because of his travels over the years. But now he's back and he's trying to make a little life for himself. He falls in love with Mirren, but because of England's occupation, they instated prima nocta. That basically means that whenever there's a wedding, a British man can take that wife into his bed for the first night and do whatever he wants with her and then give her back to her husband, which obviously the Scots aren't too happy about. So Wallace marries Mirren in secret. They have a pretty nice romance for a few scenes. The two actors clearly have chemistry together, and even though they don't have a lot of lines together, when they both smile at each other, it's just so affectionate and warm, and it just makes you believe that, yeah, these people are meant for each other, which is great because with the way this movie's paced, they really don't have that many scenes before she dies. And the scene where she dies is the first time we really get a sense of the violence and action in this movie, because this all starts when one of the soldiers gets a little too excited about Mirren and tries to have his way with her forcefully, and Wallace is not going to stand for that. He's going in. He actually makes an escape, but she doesn't get out so lucky. And because she did assault one of the officers, granted it was self-defense, but they don't see it that way. It's as if she assaulted the king himself, which means execution. They slit her throat, and that's it. And that really is the inciting incident in this movie. That's when William Wallace goes from being this kind of fun-loving, content nobleman to, okay, now we need to get the English out of our territory. It's gone too far. We need freedom. And he goes on this crusade against England throughout the rest of the movie, and it's just epic. It's epic storytelling in its most classic form. It's army against army. It's in a pre-CGI world. Again, this was 1995. They didn't really have a lot of digital effects. So the vast majority of this is practical. It's in-camera setups. You have these hundreds of extras in full costume going against each other. And I'm sure it was a grueling shoot to get through. I'm sure it was super long and tedious to wrangle all these people. But the reward is in the execution because it just looks so grand and cool, and you can't help but get swept up in the emotion of it. Every time that William Wallace wins a battle or kills a British person, you just can't help but stand up and cheer. I also think it's this movie where Mel Gibson got his taste for blood and violence in film, because this movie doesn't pull punches when it comes to gore. When people get their necks slit, you see the blood trickle down. When people are getting stabbed or their legs cut off, you see the blood going everywhere. William Wallace probably has more scenes in this movie with blood on him to some degree than with him actually having a clean face, because this movie gets violent, and I appreciate that in a movie like this because this is a very different time. This is not a clean and sanitized time. This was a very brutal time. They would fight tooth and nail to the last man, to the death, to make that happen. And this movie does effectively get that across. And then there are a couple things that do get under my skin a little bit when it comes to period pieces like this, especially with regards to the armor, because the Scots basically have no armor throughout the movie, and I'm not sure if it was historically accurate for them to wear kilts, but it's Scotland. They needed to do something to make them look Scottish, so I understand that decision, even if it's not historically accurate. But when they get shot with the arrows or stabbed or anything, it does make sense for them to lose a limb or bleed out because they're just not protected. They're just wearing cloth. The English are in full battle armor throughout this whole movie, and it's kind of laughable when, with one sword stroke, William Wallace can just cut a dude's leg off with no resistance whatsoever. So what is this armor made out of? The same thing with arrows and sword strikes to the belly. The fight choreography in this movie does leave some to be desired as far as historical accuracy, because that kind of thing does break the immersion a little bit when you're like, okay, what's this armor for? It's clearly not working. And in actual history, killing someone in battle was a lot more difficult if they were wearing armor. You had to get a little bit more creative with where you attack, what tools you use to destroy the armor first, so then you can go in for the kill. And this movie doesn't really go into that. And while that is something that I would have liked to see, I do recognize that this movie is long enough as it is, and he just wanted to make these action scenes as visceral and intense and fast-paced as possible. And if they treated armor realistically, it would have just dragged down the sequences. So I understand the decision, even though I would have liked to see a little bit more attention to detail there. But William Wallace's crusade does not go on forever. After he successfully defends Scotland, he then goes on the offense. He actually takes the city of York, which is a pretty awesome move, just tactically and strategically. He does it and it works. He succeeds. And now Longshanks and his son are really on the back foot. They're kind of panicking. They're like, okay, we need to do something to squash this rebellion. And they do a lot of underhanded things like make deals with other countries to come in as reinforcements and making backdoor deals with the lords that end up backstabbing William Wallace. There's another subplot in this movie is that William Wallace is always at odds with the lords, the establishment in Scotland. Whenever you have a revolutionary as crazed as William Wallace, you're always going to have resistance to the established people that have benefited from the oppression. It's really hard for them to sacrifice their lands, their titles, for the hope that William Wallace can defeat England, which was arguably the most powerful nation in the world. And that dynamic is brought out pretty poignantly with Robert the Bruce's character. He's the one that's constantly being torn between his loyalty to the lords and William Wallace, because his father was the king of Scotland, so to speak, but now he's got leprosy or something. He's all gross and hiding away, and he's kind of whispering in Robert's ear, is like, oh, you gotta be this great king. And nobody in Scotland is contesting his claim to the throne, which is an interesting dynamic in a movie like this. Usually you'd have this infighting, but no, everybody just accepts, okay, Robert the Bruce, he's a good man, he's loyal to Scotland, he has heritage, he's got birthright, so everyone's just willing to give him the throne. But with all that responsibility, he does still need to be on the Lord's good side, because if he goes too far against them, they might depose him as king too and appoint somebody else. So he's really caught between a rock and a hard place. The lords just want to make peace with England and live as comfortably as possible, even if that means under the oppressive rule, because they're still getting their titles and lands and everything. So they're not really hurting all that much in this situation, but it's really hard for Robert to go against William's mission, because if it does work and a free Scotland is established, that is still a million times better than being under the nicest of British oppression. So what really can he do? He tries to walk that tightrope throughout the movie, but in the end, Robert and the Lords do cut a deal with England, and they basically offer up William Wallace to the wolves. And it's this finale that really, I think, cements this movie in people's memory, because when you see William Wallace getting carted into the town square to be executed, and he's strapped down on this cross, he's just getting brutally tortured, his entrails are spilling out. All the while, there's a magistrate there that's asking him to just say the word mercy and it'll be over. Just ask for the king's mercy and they'll give it to you. They'll stop torturing you and you'll be forgiven. But William Wallace is a man of conviction. He just endures everything. He groans, he grunts. It's really hard to watch. And thankfully, this is the part of the movie that shows restraint, where you don't actually see all the entrails coming out. But as they're doing that, he lets out one last word, and it's freedom. He shouts it as loud as he can, because that's what this movie is all about. And then the axe comes down, and we get a little bit of an epilogue with what happens to him after that. His head goes up on London Bridge as a warning against anybody else that when you go against England, England's gonna win, and that's your fate. Being with that, the spirit of William Wallace, the idea of freedom and liberty, those are eternal, and those will live on. And I think that's why Braveheart is just a fantastic movie. It's so well done. Even though it's not entirely historical, there are some stylized moments in it. It holds up remarkably well all these years later. And I think a lot of that is because of just how big and grand and epic this movie feels. It's got a great message about freedom, but more importantly, it's so entertaining to watch. You see all these armies of thousands of extras that were actually on the set that day, and they're fighting each other, and the speeches. I haven't even talked about the speeches in this movie. Those are just iconic and fantastic. They're still quoted to this day. Mel Gibson just knocked out of the park with this one, and it cemented him as a really talented director. It proved that he could tell these grand stories that opened the door for a lot more movies later. Now I turn it over to you guys. What do you think about Braveheart? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. As always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.